The Arizona sun rose like a fiery brand over the Holloway Ranch, painting the dry mesas in colors of rust and gold. The wind carried the smell of dust, leather, and faint mesquite smoke. Out in that vast, merciless country where even the rocks seemed to thirst, a woman named Mary Holloway moved through the long shadows of morning. Quiet, steady, invisible. She had been Thomas Holloway's wife for 5 years, though she felt every year of it like a winter that never thawed. They'd married young after her father's passing, left her little choice but to take a husband who could provide. Thomas was a good man by most measures, sober, hardworking, upright in the eyes of neighbors and God. But to Mary, he was a stranger whose heart had hardened into stone long before she met him. Every morning followed the same ritual. Mary rose before dawn, pulling her hair into a simple knot, and went to light the kitchen stove. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet, and outside she could already hear Thomas's boots striking the ground, his voice calling to the horses in the barn. He spoke to them with more affection than he'd ever shown her. By the time she served breakfast, biscuits, beans, and coffee black as tar, Thomas had washed, prayed silently, and sat down without a word. He ate quickly, his gaze never lifting from his plate. The only sound was the scrape of cutlery and the clocks ticking on the mantel. Mary often tried to fill the silence with small things. The weather, the calves born the night before, a neighbor's passing visit, but her words died in the still air. Thomas would nod, grunt, and rise from his chair as soon as he was done. She would watch him go, hat low over his eyes, the dust already swallowing him by the time he reached the far fence line. He was not cruel. He never raised his voice nor his hand. But his absence, even when he was in the room, was a kind of quiet cruelty that bled her dry. The other ranch wives often said she was lucky. They whispered in church pews and at market stalls, admiring her husband's discipline in their tidy homestead. A woman couldn't ask for better than Thomas Holloway, they'd say. He's respectable, he keeps her fed. Mary would smile because that's what was expected. But deep down she would think, respectable isn't the same as kind. Fed isn't the same as loved. At night, when Thomas came in from the range, she would prepare supper and they would sit across from each other as though miles apart. Afterward, he'd read scripture by lamplight, his voice even and hollow. Then he would turn in early, lying beside her like a block of ice, the bed large enough to hold a lifetime of distance. Mary often stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of the wooden beams, and wondered if all wives felt like this, half dead, half longing. She missed laughter. She missed touch. She missed the woman she had been before, the girl who once believed love was like sunlight, something that warmed even the loneliest places. Sometimes, to breathe again, she would ride out alone across the open plains. Her horse Daisy was a gray mare with a temperament as gentle as morning dew. Out there, away from the house, Mary felt something loosen inside her, a spirit long shackled by silence. The land itself became her confidant. She would ride until the house was a speck behind her, until all she could see was horizon, raw, endless, burning gold. The wind in her hair spoke to her like an old friend. It carried whispers through the canyons, secrets of a time before fences and laws. Those rides were her escape. Out there, she wasn't Thomas's wife. She was just Mary, alive, breathing, free. But one evening, something changed. It was late spring and the sky was bruised with the colors of dusk. She had ridden farther than she ever had before, following a narrow trail that wound along a ridge overlooking the desert below. The air shimmered with heat, and in the distance she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from beyond the hills. It wasn't the smoke of a ranch fire. It was darker, wilder. Mary pulled her reins tight and watched. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of burning cedar and sage. Her heart quickened. Thomas had told her many times not to ride near the borderlands beyond the San Pedro River. That's Apache country, he'd warned. You keep to the safe side of the canyon. But something about that distant smoke drew her, a feeling she couldn't name, a tug in her chest as if fate itself had lit that fire. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of that smoke haunted her, curling upward like a signal meant for her alone. She lay awake beside Thomas, listening to the wind against the window panes, her mind full of questions she dared not speak aloud. Who were the people beyond those hills? What lives did they lead, free of sermons and dinner tables where love never spoke its name? It wasn't rebellion she felt. It was hunger, Not for danger, but for meaning, for connection. For someone who might see her as more than a quiet figure moving through a house. At dawn, she rose before her husband and went out to the porch. The desert stretched before her, shimmering under the early light. The world was vast and she was small, but something inside her had begun to stir. The ranch looked the same as it always had. The corral, the stables, the endless fences marking where one man's claim ended and another's began. But to Mary it suddenly felt smaller, as if the fences had grown higher around her heart. Days passed, but the longing did not fade. She tried to push it away, to lose herself in chores and church and the rhythm of the ranch. But that faint wisp of smoke lingered in her memory, a sign of another world, untamed and alive. Sometimes she would find herself standing at the edge of the field, staring southward toward the canyons. Her pulse would quicken with the same wildness that had once made her laugh as a girl. One evening, while Thomas was away mending fences, she saddled Daisy and rode out again, not out of defiance, but out of a need she could no longer deny. As the sun bled into the horizon, the world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere out there, beyond the sandstone cliffs and endless sky, something waited, a destiny written not by duty or name, but by the heart's unspoken yearning. Mary didn't know what she was searching for, but she knew with every beat of her heart that something was about to change, something she had buried deep within her, the part that still believed in love, had begun to wake. And when she looked toward the darkening canyon that evening, she thought she saw movement, a figure watching from afar, tall and still as the desert itself. She couldn't be sure if it was real or just the desert light playing tricks on her eyes. But deep inside, Mary felt it, that this moment was the beginning of something she could never turn back from. The morning after that strange twilight ride, the memory still burned in Mary's mind. The faint shape on the ridge, the feeling that unseen eyes had followed her across the desert. She told herself it was nothing more than fatigue, the mirage of loneliness playing tricks on her senses. But part of her heart, the part that still dared to dream, whispered otherwise. 3 days later, her world changed forever. It was late afternoon when she rode out again, the heat sharp as a brand on her skin. Thomas was off trading in Bisbee and the ranch hands were mending fences miles away. The land lay silent under a wide, cloudless sky. Mary saddled Daisy and followed the same trail toward the canyon, the one her husband had warned her about since the day they wed. She wasn't sure why she went. Curiosity, perhaps, or that strange pull she could no longer fight. The feeling that something waited for her out there, something that could give breath to the hollow within her chest. The trail wound steeply through red rock and twisted mesquite. Lizards darted underfoot and a hawk circled high above, its cry echoing through the stillness. As she reached the ridge, a sudden noise split the silence, owing a sharp crack like thunder. Daisy reared, frightened by a rattlesnake's hiss from the rocks below. Mary lost her grip. The world turned over in a blur of color and sound. She struck the ground hard, her breath torn from her lungs. The horse bolted, hooves pounding away down the canyon. For a long moment, all was silent except for the dry rustle of wind through the grass. When Mary opened her eyes, the sky above her swam in waves of heat. Pain throbbed in her ankle, white-hot and deep. She tried to sit, but the world tilted. A shadow fell across her face. At first she thought it was another trick of the light, but then the shadow moved, slow and deliberate until it became a man. He stood tall, his skin sun-bronzed, his chest bare but for a leather strap that held a hunting knife. His hair was long and black, falling past his shoulders, and his eyes, dark, calm, unblinking, caught the sun like polished obsidian. Mary's heart froze. She knew without doubt that she was staring at an Apache. The man spoke, his voice low and even, words she couldn't understand. He crouched beside her, studying her face, his expression unreadable. She felt fear first, sharp, instinctive, but it softened as his hand, rough but careful, touched her ankle. He pointed toward it, and then toward her horse's tracks, disappearing down the canyon. She nodded weakly, too stunned to speak. Then, without asking, he lifted her. Mary gasped. He was strong. She could feel it in the way his arms tightened around her, steady and sure, carrying her as though she weighed no more than a child. His scent was wild, smoke, leather, earth after rain. He carried her through the canyon down to a small hollow shaded by cottonwoods. There, beside a trickling stream, sat a rough camp, a fire pit, a blanket of hides, and a bough resting on a rock. He set her down gently and began gathering herbs from a pouch. Mary watched him move, graceful and silent as the land itself. He ground the herbs, added water, and began to bind her ankle with long strips of soft hide. She flinched as his fingers brushed her skin, but his touch was gentle, deliberate, almost reverent. When he finished, he looked into her eyes and spoke a single word, slow and clear. "Taza." She pointed to herself, her voice trembling. "Mary," he repeated it softly. "Mari," as though tasting the sound. Something in the way he said it made her heart twist. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the wind in the cottonwoods. Mary studied him, the lines of his face strong and proud, the scar that ran along his jaw, the calm in his movements. He seemed older than she first thought, maybe in his 30s, though his eyes held lifetimes. He watched her too, curious but unthreatening. Occasionally he said something in his language, short phrases she couldn't understand, but his tone was kind. Once he offered her a piece of dried meat. When she shook her head, he smiled faintly and ate it himself. As dusk deepened, he built a small fire. The light flickered across his face, and for the first time, Mary saw something human there. Not the fierce savage her husband and neighbors had described, but a man with sorrow behind his eyes. He spoke again, slow and broken in English this time. "You hurt." "I fixed," she nodded. "You did." "Thank you." He tilted his head slightly, trying to understand. Then quietly he said, "You..." Afraid Mary hesitated. She should have been. Every story she'd heard told her so. But sitting there beneath the cottonwoods, the fire's warmth between them, she realized she wasn't. Not at all. "No," she said softly. "Not anymore." Night settled around them, deep and star-filled. The canyon glowed silver under the moonlight. Taza sat near the fire, sharpening a knife, his face calm and distant. Mary watched him from where she rested, her thoughts tangled. She wondered about his life, where he had come from, whether he had family, what sorrows had carved those shadows into his gaze. She thought of Thomas, his cold eyes, his clipped prayers, the distance that filled their home. Something in her chest ached, a strange mix of guilt and awakening. Taza looked up suddenly, meeting her gaze. For a long moment neither spoke. In those dark, steady eyes she saw something that startled her. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she felt. Loneliness, hunger, the unspoken need to be seen. He said something then, softly, a phrase she didn't understand. His voice was like low thunder, deep and warm. He pointed toward the stars, then to his chest, and then, gently, to hers. She didn't know the words, but she understood. Somehow, across all barriers of tongue and world, she understood. By dawn, her ankle no longer throbbed. When she rose to leave, Taza walked her back toward the ridge. The wind whipped through the canyon, carrying dust and the cry of hawks. When they reached the place where Daisy's tracks had faded, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said, though she knew the words might mean nothing to him. But he nodded, slowly, and said, "Mary," her name, spoken in his low voice, sounded different, softer, sacred somehow. He gestured toward the horizon, to the far-off ranch. Then he turned back toward the canyon without another word, disappearing into the rocks like a shadow melting into the morning light. Mary rode home in silence, the sun at her back. Her mind should have been filled with fear, what Thomas would say, what danger she'd faced, but all she could think about were those eyes. They were not cruel, nor desperate. They were alive, more alive than any eyes she had ever seen. That night, as she lay beside her husband in the same cold bed, she closed her eyes and felt again the ghost of Taza's touch, gentle, certain, human, and for the first time in years, she dreamed. The days that followed her meeting with Taza were both endless and unbearable. Mary Halloway went through the motions of ranch life as though she were half awake, tending the chickens, mending shirts, sweeping dust that always returned by nightfall. But her hands worked without her heart. Her thoughts drifted always to the canyon, to the man who had carried her through the wild as gently as a father lifts a child. At supper, Thomas spoke of drought, prices, and politics, the language of a man who had forgotten how to feel. Mary nodded where custom required, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment in that shaded hollow, the sound of the stream, the warmth of Taza's gaze, the way he had spoken her name like it was something precious. Each night she lay beside her husband and felt the weight of a truth she could not bear, that she had come alive in the arms of a stranger. For weeks she resisted the urge to return. She told herself it was madness. The Apaches were outlaws in the eyes of her people. She would be risking her life, her marriage, her very soul if anyone discovered her trespass, and yet something deeper than reason kept calling her back. One morning, while Thomas was gone to Tucson for supplies, she gave in. The moment the wagon wheels vanished down the road, she saddled Daisy and turned her toward the south, toward the canyon that had branded itself upon her heart. The sun was fierce that day, and the wind dry as powder. She rode fast, fear and desire knotted tight in her chest. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo her heartbeat. She didn't know if he would still be there, or if she would ever see him again. When she reached the edge of the ridge, her breath caught. Smoke drifted from the canyon floor, thin and blue. The same scent of burning cedar she remembered from that first day. She called softly, "Taza." For a moment there was only the whisper of the wind. Then from the shadows of the cottonwoods he appeared. He was barefoot, bare-chested, his dark hair tied with a strip of leather. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, but there was no surprise, only quiet knowing. He approached slowly, like one might approach a wild creature that has chosen to return on its own. Mary dismounted, her legs trembling. I shouldn't have come," she said, her voice thin in the wide silence. Taza studied her face. Then, in his rough English, he said, "You come because hearts say come." The simplicity of it undid her. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. He stepped closer, reached out, and with one finger brushed the tear from her cheek. His touch was light, but it burned through her like sunlight after endless winter. They sat beside the river where the cottonwoods leaned over the water. Through broken words and gestures they spoke, of small things, of life, of loss. She told him her husband was a good man but cold, that she had forgotten what it meant to be seen. He listened without judgment. When she faltered, he would nod once, his eyes steady on hers, and say softly, "You lonely?" She smiled sadly. "Yes." Then he told her of his people, the Chiricahua Apache, hunted, scattered, forced into barren lands. His father killed by soldiers, his brothers lost to the desert. "I have no home," he said quietly. "Only sky." She looked at him, this man whose world had been taken, and felt her heart twist. In his loss, she saw a mirror of her own. She had a house, land, a husband, yet she too was homeless in her soul. As the afternoon waned, thunder rolled across the distant mountains. Storm clouds gathered fast, heavy and dark. Taza rose and motioned toward a cave not far from the riverbank. "Rain come," he said. By the time they reached it, the storm had broken. Rain fell in thick sheets, drumming on the rocks. Inside, the air was cool, the firelight flickering gold across the cave walls. Taza built a small blaze from dry twigs he'd kept beneath the stone. Mary sat near the fire, her dress damp and clinging to her skin. Steam rose from her hair. She shivered, though not entirely from the cold. Taza knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. He took a blanket from his pack and wrapped it around her shoulders. When his hands brushed her arms, her breath caught. Their eyes met. His dark and searching, hers wide and uncertain. The sound of the rain faded, or perhaps the world itself did. There was only the heat of the fire and the closeness of him. He reached up gently to touch her cheek. She didn't move. "Why you sad, Mari?" he asked softly. "Because I forgot what it feels like," she whispered. "What?" "To be wanted." The words escaped her before she could think. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then slowly Taza leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. The gesture was tender, reverent, a silent question. She answered not with words, but by closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was soft, uncertain, the meeting of two worlds that were never meant to touch. But the moment his lips met hers, something deep within her broke open, flooding her with warmth and ache and relief. He kissed her like a man who had known too much loss, too much silence. His hands trembled slightly as they moved to her shoulders, then her back, as though afraid she might vanish. Mary clung to him, her heart racing. She had known men's touch before, but never like this. Thomas's hands had been cold, dutiful, without soul. But Taza's touch, it was a language of its own. He didn't take, he gave. Every movement spoke of wonder, of gratitude, of seeing her. The rain outside became a distant song. Time fell away. When at last the storm eased, they lay side by side beneath the blanket, the fire glowing low. Her head rested against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Strong, alive, unbroken despite all the world had done to him. Neither spoke. There were no words for what had passed between them. At dawn, the air was fresh, the canyon washed clean by the storm. Taza helped her to her feet, his expression quiet but knowing. He traced a finger down her cheek, then over her lips. "You go," he said softly. "If stay world hurt you." She nodded, tears burning her eyes. "And you?" He smiled faintly, the saddest smile she had ever seen. "I live with Sky." When she rode home, the land felt different, brighter, sharper, alive. Every color seemed deeper, every breath fuller. But her joy was laced with fear. She knew what she had done was unforgivable in the eyes of her world, yet she could not regret it. That night, as Thomas sat reading his Bible, Mary looked at him across the lamplight and knew she would never belong to that cold silence again. Something inside her had changed, something that could never be undone. She had touched the forbidden, and it had touched her back. And though the storm had passed, she knew that the reckoning was still to come. The days that followed Mary's return from the canyon were haunted and hollow. She moved through the Holloway Ranch like a ghost wearing her own skin, cooking, cleaning, speaking when spoken to. But the fire that had been kindled inside her could not be hidden. It burned too bright. Thomas noticed it first, not in her words, but in her silence. His wife, once mild and meek, now seemed distant, her eyes elsewhere when he spoke. She hummed softly as she worked, a tune he didn't know. And sometimes, when the wind came from the south, she would pause at the porch rail and stare toward the canyons for long minutes. At first he thought it was simple restlessness, the kind that came over women when the isolation of ranch life wore them down. But soon, the whispers began. A ranch hand from the neighboring claim had seen her riding south, toward Apache land. Then another said she'd been spotted near the river, talking to a man not of her kind. By the time the gossip reached Thomas in the saloon at Tombstone, it had grown into a wildfire. He came home that night, drunk for the first time in years. His boots struck the floorboards like gunshots. "Where were you last Thursday, Mary?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. Mary froze, the half-washed dishes slipping from her hands. I was riding the lower pasture." He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the lamp. "Don't lie to me, they saw you. You've been going where no decent woman ought to go," she swallowed hard. "Thomas, is it true?" His face was red with fury, his hands trembling. "You been with one of them?" The word struck her like a lash. Shame, fear, and defiance tangled inside her. For a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly she met his eyes. Yes. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Thomas stared at her as though she were a stranger. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and walked out of the house without another word. Mary stood there shaking, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She had not meant to confess, but she could no longer bear the lie. Whatever came now, it was too late to turn back. 2 days later, the reckoning came. Thomas rode into the yard with 2 ranch hands and the sheriff trailing behind. Dust rose behind their horses like smoke. Mary was standing on the porch when they arrived. The men dismounted, their faces grim. Thomas's eyes were empty, not with sorrow, but with a cold, steady hatred that frightened her more than any weapon could. "We're going after him," he said. "The Apache. The one who's been trespassing on my land and defiling my wife." Her breath caught. "Thomas, please, no, he's not." But Thomas was already checking his rifle. The sheriff shifted uneasily but said nothing. Mary stepped forward, clutching her apron. "He saved my life, Thomas, you don't understand." Thomas turned on her, his jaw tight. "I understand enough. You brought shame on this house. I'll see it washed clean before sundown." He mounted his horse, and without another word, The men rode south. Mary stood frozen, her mind a storm. Then something in her broke loose. She ran inside, threw on her shawl, and saddled Daisy. If they meant to kill Taza, she would not let it happen. The desert stretched before her, endless and burning. The wind carried dust into her eyes, but she didn't slow. She rode hard toward the canyon, praying she would be in time. When she reached the ridge, she saw them, 3 riders below, closing in on the cottonwoods by the river. And there, standing like a shadow against the sun, was Taza. He was alone, unarmed but unafraid. Thomas shouted something she couldn't hear, and a shot cracked the air. "Taza!" Mary screamed, her voice tearing through the canyon. She spurred Daisy down the slope, sliding from the saddle before the horse even stopped. The men turned as she ran between them, throwing herself in front of Taza. "Stop! Don't shoot!" she cried. Thomas dismounted, his rifle still raised. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "Get away from him, Mary!" "He saved me," she pleaded. "That day my horse threw me. He could have left me there, but he didn't. He cared for me, Thomas. He showed me kindness when no one else did." Her husband's hand tightened on the rifle. "You've lost your mind." She stepped closer, trembling. I found it. I found it in that canyon. You never loved me, Thomas. You just owned me." A murmur passed between the men, uneasy. The sheriff glanced away. Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "You'd throw away your name, your God, your people. For him?" Mary's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. For one moment of truth, yes. For a heartbeat, Thomas hesitated. Then rage overcame him. He lifted the rifle. Taza moved like lightning. He lunged forward, striking the barrel aside just as the shot went off. The bullet tore through the air, grazing his shoulder. In one motion, he pushed Mary behind him and drew his knife. Chaos erupted. The ranch hands fired wildly. One bullet struck the rocks, another tore through Taza's side. He staggered but didn't fall. "Stop it!" Mary screamed. She ran to Thomas, clawing at the rifle. "Enough! Enough!" He froze, staring at her, his wife, standing between him and the man he hated, her arms outstretched. The rifle slipped from his hands. For a moment, no one moved. The canyon fell silent again, save for the wind and the slow trickle of the river. Then Taza fell to one knee, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers. Mary dropped beside him. "No, no, no." He looked up at her, his face pale, his lips curved in a faint smile. "I not dead yet, Mari." She pressed her hands to his wound, desperate. "You have to live." Behind them, Thomas turned away, his voice hoarse. "Let him die, Mary. You made your choice." He mounted his horse and rode off, the others following, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Mary held Taza close, her tears falling freely. "You can't die," she whispered. "Not like this." He reached up weakly, his hand brushing her cheek. "You go," he murmured. "They come back?" "No," she said fiercely. "I'm not leaving you." But he was already fading, his breath shallow, his eyes half closed. Mary looked toward the canyon walls, toward the hidden paths only he had known. She had one chance. With trembling hands, she helped him to his feet, half carrying him through the brush and into the shadows of the cliffs. Behind them, the sun sank low, bleeding red into the desert sky. The reckoning had come, but the story was not yet done. That night, she built a small fire deep in the canyon, binding his wound as best she could. His breathing was ragged, but when he opened his eyes, there was peace in them. "You should not have stayed," he whispered. Mary smiled faintly, brushing the sweat from his brow. "You once said you had no home but the sky. Then let me share it with you, just for tonight." He stared at her for a long moment, then reached for her hand. "Then tonight," he said softly, "you are my sky." The stars turned slowly above them, cold and bright. And in that wild, unforgiving land where blood and dust had soaked the soil for generations, 2 souls, one born of the frontier, one hunted by it, found a kind of peace the world would never understand. The dawn broke soft and pale over the canyon, painting the cliffs in streaks of gold and rose. The desert wind had quieted, leaving only the faint crackle of the dying fire and the soft sound of Taza's breathing. Mary stirred from her half-sleep beside him. Her dress was torn and stained with blood, her hair tangled. But her eyes, those gentle blue eyes once dulled by years of loveless duty, now burned with fierce tenderness. Taza's wound had stopped bleeding, but fever shimmered across his brow. She dipped her handkerchief in cool water and pressed it gently to his skin. He stirred, opening his eyes with a faint smile. "You still here, Mari?" "Still here," she whispered. "And not going anywhere." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. "You stubborn woman." She smiled through tears. "Takes one to love one." He looked at her then, really looked, as if trying to memorize her face before the sun rose too high and burned the moment away. "You should go. Your people, they come." Mary shook her head. "I'm not afraid anymore. Not of them, not of anything. You taught me that." Taza's gaze softened. "I teach you nothing. You always had fire. You just forget it." She looked away, her throat tight. "Maybe I did. But when I was with you that night by the river, when you touched my hand, when you looked at me, I remembered what it was to feel alive." He reached up weakly, brushing her cheek. "You feel alive now?" "Yes," she whispered. "For the first time in 5 years, I do." They stayed hidden as the sun climbed higher. Mary listened to the distant sound of horses, riders moving through the valley. Thomas and the sheriff must have returned hunting. Taza sat up slowly, grimacing. "They will not stop. I go east, over the ridge." "You go home." Mary shook her head. "No, I can't go back there." "You're home," he said softly. "Your place." She stared at the dust beneath her boots. "That house hasn't been a home for a long time. I was just a ghost in it, a wife in name only." He frowned. "If you stay with me, you have no safety. My people, they scatter. Soldiers come. You would suffer." Mary looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I already suffered. You gave me peace, even if it was only one night. I'll carry that with me forever." She leaned closer, her hand against his chest where the bandage lay. "But I won't let you die alone." Taza's breath trembled. He reached for her hand, closing his fingers around hers. "Then we stay, Mon, until the wind takes us." By noon the heat grew heavy. The air shimmered. Mary sat in the shadow of the rock, watching Taza drift in and out of sleep. Every so often he would whisper something in his language, soft, lyrical sounds she didn't understand. When he woke again, she asked, "What do those words mean?" He smiled faintly. "It is a prayer, for the wind to carry our spirits where they belong." She brushed his hair back gently. "Where do you think spirits belong?" "In the place they loved most," he said. "Maybe in a canyon, maybe under stars, maybe beside someone they can never forget." Her throat tightened. "Then I hope mine stays here." Hours passed. The sound of horses returned faintly on closer this time. Thomas's men no doubt sweeping the area. Mary's heart thudded. She looked to Taza. "We have to move." He shook his head. "No more strength. But you can go. Live, remember." Tears welled in her eyes. "Don't make me leave you." He gave a slow, weary smile. "You already part of me. Even if you go, you stay." Mary pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "Then I'll stay until the end." He closed his eyes, and for a long time they said nothing. Only the wind spoke, soft, mournful, carrying the scent of rain far off in the mountains. When the riders finally appeared at the mouth of the canyon, the sky had darkened with an oncoming storm. Thomas was in front, his face drawn and pale. The sheriff rode beside him, hand on his holster. Mary stood, shielding Taza with her body as they approached. "Mary?" Thomas called out. His voice was hoarse. "Step aside." She didn't move. "He's dying, Thomas. Let him be." Thomas dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the sand. For a long time he said nothing. Then, in a voice quieter than she expected, he asked, "Why him?" Mary looked down at Taza, then back at the man she had once called husband. "Because he looked at me like I was alive. You looked at me like I was duty." Her words struck deep. Thomas's shoulders sagged. "You could have told me." She shook her head sadly. "Would you have listened?" He said nothing. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Tom, we best go. Ain't no sense in blood now. He's finished." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on his wife, the woman he had never truly known. Then we go. Before he mounted his horse, he looked at her one last time. You can come home if you want, Mary. I'll leave the door open. She met his eyes, calm and steady. That door was closed a long time ago. He nodded once, then turned his horse toward the horizon. The thunder rumbled low as the men rode away. That night, the rain came. Soft at first, then heavy. Mary sat beside Taza beneath a small overhang, holding him close as the world washed clean around them. He was fading fast, his breath shallow, but he looked at her one last time and smiled. The rain, it sounded like your tears, he murmured. She laughed softly through her sobs. You always did talk pretty for a warrior. He managed a faint chuckle, then whispered, When I go, don't cry too long. Look to the wind. I will be there. Taza, she breathed, her voice breaking. Please stay. He looked at her with infinite tenderness. I stay. In you. And with that, the last breath left his lips, carried away by the storm that swept the canyon. Mary held him until the rain stopped. Then she laid him gently upon the earth, covering him with her shawl. When dawn came again, she stood at the edge of the ridge, the desert stretching endless and golden before her. The world felt vast and then strangely alive. She turned once more toward the canyon, her eyes soft with tears but full of light. Then she whispered, Goodbye, my love, Gyan, and walked toward the rising sun. Years later, folks in Tombstone still whispered about her, the rancher's wife who vanished after the Apache raids. Some said she ran off east. Others swore they saw her wandering the desert. Her hair silver, her face peaceful. But old travelers, those who knew the canyons well, spoke of something different. They said that on quiet nights, when the wind turned warm and the stars shone bright, you could hear two voices in the canyon, one speaking in soft English, the other in Apache, like laughter carried by the wind. And somewhere beneath those endless skies, love, once forbidden, once fleeting, still lingered. One night of love, one lifetime of memory, that was all she ever needed.